We know from clues in the text that an amount of time has passed on the island between chapters 2 and 3. How much time is not stated directly, but if you think about how long it takes for your hair to be considerably longer than before, you might conclude that it's months rather than weeks. The chapter begins with Jack hunting in the forest, and despite originally being part of a larger group of hunting boys, the rest have lost interest and gone back to the beach, and Jack is now alone. He has changed considerably from the image of head choir boy we were presented with in chapter 1. He is bent double, with his face only a few inches from the earth. Like an animal on all fours, he is following the trail of a pig. And he hunts like an animal, listening, smelling, and he's practiced this skill to the point where he's able to detect even the faintest clues, like cracked twigs, hoof prints, or the polished underside of a creeper made by the bristly hides of pigs passing through it. We can also see from this description just how well Jack has adapted to life on the island. He's dispensed with his gown and school uniform and is almost completely naked. He is at one with the forest, and his appearance with knife belt, spear and long hair is already starting to resemble a primitive tribesman rather than the public school head boy and leader of the choir who prided himself on being able to sing C-sharp. The suggestion that Jack is regressing to a more primitive state, an earlier phase of man's evolution, is developed here in the next paragraph. Firstly, through his surroundings. A bird is roused from a primitive nest of sticks, and the cry which comes from it appears to come from the abyss of ages. Then there's the description of Jack himself, who's described as ape-like. And in previous chapters I talked about how furious at himself Jack was when he failed to become chief and then failed to kill a pig. And the result of these two failures is Jack's determination to succeed as a hunter. And we can see here how that determination has become an obsession. The frustration of the hunt claims him, almost like it's taken him over. And when he finds a fresh pile of pig's droppings in the next paragraph, he knows that the hunt is reaching its conclusion. Jack raises himself to his full height and hurls the spear at the sound of the running pig, a sound which is both seductive and maddening. The need to kill has become powerfully attractive for Jack, but here, as before, he is not successful. When he emerges from the jungle, Ralph is the first person he meets. While Jack has been hunting, Ralph has been building shelters. And this is important because for Jack, hunting is a purely selfish act. Although later it might appear his ability to kill pigs brings benefits to some of the boys and relieves them of their monotonous fruit diet, the act of hunting itself at this point serves no one but Jack. His need to prove himself and be successful is so all-consuming that he really can't see beyond it. Ralph, on the other hand, is performing a task which will benefit all of the boys, and the only person helping him is Simon. Ralph is frustrated because it's taken a lot of time and effort to construct the shelter, and the adjective wreck, which Golding uses to describe it, suggests that their efforts have not been rewarded with any particular success. As I mentioned before, there are a number of important symbols in this book, and the huts are used by Golding to represent the society the boys are attempting to create. The description of the shelters being in position but shaky, and this one was a ruin, indicates that the civilised society that the boys are struggling to create on the island is equally shaky and likely to collapse. Ralph is also frustrated because he isn't getting a lot of help with this difficult job from the other boys. At the meetings, which the boys frequently have, everyone agrees to work hard until the shelters were built, but the little ones keep running off, and the older boys are off bathing or eating or playing. And so Ralph has an early indication that being chief and leading this group of boys is not going to be all fun and games. It comes with the responsibility of ensuring that everyone contributes for the good of society. And when Simon says, "You're chief, you tell 'em off," as perhaps an adult would do, Ralph gazes at the sky and doesn't respond. Instead, He bemoans the fact that all the talk that goes on at the meetings and all the ambitious ideas they come up with are met with very little commitment or determination to action. Jack takes this criticism quite personally. The fact that he flushed with embarrassment shows that Jack is conscious that he hasn't been helping either, but reminds Ralph that we want meat, and so attempts to justify his long excursions in the forest. This section of the book reveals two things. Firstly, it serves as another rich pool of evidence to show how Jack is becoming obsessed with hunting. We've got, he tried to convey the compulsion to track down and kill that was swallowing him up, along with the madness came into his eyes again. And it also shows how the enthusiastic friendship between Jack and Ralph of the first two chapters is beginning to get strained. And this strain is as a direct result of the differing responsibilities that the two boys have. And you can see that in these two short exchanges in dialogue. Jack's assertion, again, we want meat, with Ralph's we need shelters. The strain is also shown in the penultimate sentence of this section, which I'm highlighting here, that they were both red in the face and found looking at each other difficult. To escape this moment, Ralph changes the subject. He talks about the behaviour of the other boys, in particular the little uns. Jack says that he hasn't noticed, so Ralph informs him that they're clearly frightened. They have nightmares and scream, even some of the older boys. And these two boys have been so involved in their own disagreement that they'd forgotten that Simon was even there, so when he speaks, they are surprised at the interruption. As usual with Simon, the few words that he speaks are significant, and his comments about the beast in particular are the most interesting in the novel and operate on a far more conceptual level than any other boy on the island. He articulates these views at various significant moments in the novel, but here it is simply to give greater authority to the claims that the little uns made earlier in chapter 2. He says, it's as if the beastie or the snake thing was real. Both Jack and Ralph are dismissive of this, saying that the younger boys are crackers, but Jack admits that he has some understanding of how they feel when he is alone and hunting in the forest. What Jack is reaching for in this section is not some empathetic understanding of the feelings of the younger boys, right? He does not care about that, but this is more to do with an ability to articulate his own savage tremors of fear caused by the darkness and isolation he experiences in the forest, together with his obsessive and consuming determination to kill. Now, I mentioned Jack's obsessive behaviour here, and there are further examples of this before this chapter is over. Ralph responds to what Jack has just spoken by saying that the best thing they can do is to get themselves rescued. And Jack had to think for a moment before he could remember what rescue was. And even when he does remember, he still prioritises his desire to catch a pig first before the opaque, mad look comes into his eyes again. The conversation between the two boys then turns to the fire, which, for Ralph, is the most important thing on the island. And as they trot down the beach, they turn and look up at the fire on the mountain. Ralph considers the distance at which the signal might be seen. I wonder how far you could see that before the column of smoke appears to thicken slightly, and Ralph, perhaps more in hope than expectation, searches the horizon in case a ship has been spotted. The exclamation from Jack, "Got it!" which follows this, makes Ralph think that Jack has in fact seen a ship. But in fact the whole time, Jack has been staring up at the mountain and considering where the pigs go to during the hottest part of the day. At this, Ralph is at first bewildered, and then his frustration finally boils over. "I was talking about smoke. Don't you want to be rescued? All you can talk about is pig, pig, pig. Jack repeats his refrain of, "But we want meat," in an exclamation which reflects his own anger at Ralph's outburst. And that's the point. Neither of these boys can understand the other. Both claim to be acting for the common good of all the boys on the island. Jack, through his attempts to provide them with meat, and Ralph through his commitment to fire and shelters. But the key difference is articulated by Ralph at the end of this extract. You like it. You want to hunt. And once again we see Ralph's growing awareness of the burden of responsibility. While Ralph sees Jack as someone realising the vision of being stranded on a Pacific island which Ralph had at the start of the story, he almost has to acknowledge that being chief is not what he thought it was going to be like, and that he's not enjoying it. After all, it's hard work providing for the basic needs of a community who do little to help or support you. The peak of this row, or disagreement at least, seems at odds with the beautiful surroundings which Golding reminds us of, with its bright beach, sand, swimming pool and brilliant water. And the boys themselves are astonished at the strength of their feelings. And I ask you again to remember that even the oldest of the boys are only about 12 years old, and so feelings of this intensity might be fairly unusual. Another thing which seems to be growing in Ralph's awareness is that people were never quite what you thought they were. And he's thinking about Jack. Remember that in the first 2 chapters, Jack and Ralph are clearly established as friends. Ralph rejects Piggy's offer as friendship in favour of Jack, and here we see him taking the first step towards questioning this decision. Don't get me wrong, Ralph is not necessarily thinking about his relationship with Piggy here, although it's interesting to note Golding's brief mention of him lying down and staring in the water, but he is clearly reframing his perception of Jack. For his part, Jack seems, at least partially, to recognise that Ralph's complaints are legitimate and grudgingly offers to do a bit for you, which Ralph correctly identifies as tokenistic at best, and tells him not to bother. When the 2 boys return to the shelters, they notice that Simon is no longer there. And this detail is worth remembering for what we find out about Simon and where he has gone to at the end of this chapter. But before we get there, we can find further evidence of the differing priorities of Ralph and Jack. Despite the setting sun, Jack is determined to trek over to the other side of the mountain to see if his theory about where the pigs go to during the day is correct. His invitation for Ralph to go with him here is only met with exasperation, and so now both boys have had opportunities to experience each other's daily lives firsthand, and both opportunities have been rejected. The line that I've highlighted here, they walked along 2 continents of experience and feeling, unable to communicate, is one of the most important from the early chapters of the book, as it serves to illustrate a number of things. Firstly, that these are 2 of the most important and powerful boys on the island. Secondly, the different lives and experiences that they are having on the island. Then there are the different feelings associated with these experiences. Ralph's enormous sense of responsibility and Jack's obsession with hunting. And finally, the fact that these priorities are so different and so polarising that they simply cannot understand one another and cannot hope to communicate in a way that would make the other sympathise. What the reader should also feel anxious about here is that the shouting and splashing and laughing which follows this argument are only just sufficient to bring them back together again. The relationship has been strained to a point where another confrontation like this might snap it all together. Golding deliberately divides what's come before in this chapter from what is about to be described in order to emphasise its importance. The boys, Ralph and Jack, had expected to find Simon working on the huts, which is where they left him, but they returned to find that he's gone. And the narrative now switches perspective, so that the description is focalised entirely through the character of Simon, who's followed the other boys for a few yards before stopping. This is one of so many areas in the novel where the reader can really stand back and enjoy the attention to detail of his description without a lot of distracting action. I mean, look at the detail that I've highlighted here. So easy to miss, of Simon standing, frowning down at a pile of sand on the beach where somebody had been trying to build a little house or hut, which is reminiscent of two earlier incidents from this chapter. Firstly, the pile of droppings which Jack stares at during his hunt in the forest, and secondly, the huts which Ralph and Simon have so unsuccessfully been trying to build on the beach. The first of these connections serves as a contrast between the savage determination to kill, which is growing within Jack, compared to the implicit sensitivity of Simon, while the second adds to the sense of a society which is fragile and likely to collapse. This, by the way, is not the only time that the behaviour of the little uns will mirror that of the older boys, and we'll need to pick those up as we go through. Golding then gives the reader the first real, physical description of Simon, who is a small, skinny boy, his chin pointed and his eyes so bright they deceived Ralph into thinking him delightfully gay and wicked, so that it's possible for us to remember Pan from J.M. Barrie's story. And despite his lack of any real significance over the last 2.5 chapters, he will become one of 4 or arguably 5 major characters in this narrative, and so what will be described over the next couple of pages is really important. The direction that Simon is taking as he walks away from the beach and into the forest is one that he has walked many times before, and we can tell this by his accustomed tread. The description that Golding employs throughout the next few paragraphs is full of sensual images depicting nature at its most beautiful. An impression of natural abundance is created through the acres of fruit trees, the pervasive smell of ripe fruit, and the million bees. Simon is being followed through this beautiful part of the forest by a group of little uns who pull and tug Simon towards the fruit trees, and there Simon finds for them the fruit they could not reach, pulled off the choicest from up in the foliage, passed them back down to the endless outstretched hands. And this line is a really key one when thinking about Simon and the way that Golding presents him in the novel. Firstly, think about what Simon is doing here, right? He's feeding the little uns fruit, the fruit that they cannot reach because it's too high up in the branches. No one else has been doing this. And if the little uns haven't been able to feed themselves with the choicest fruit, then the obvious conclusion is that they've been surviving so far by scavenging the overripe fruit which has fallen to the floor. So Simon is shown to be kind and sensitive and aware of the needs of others. But the other and much wider significance of this description in terms of our reading of Lord of the Flies is the way that it associates Simon with the biblical figure of Christ, and specifically the way that the endless outstretched hands remind us of the feeding of the 5,000. In terms of big ideas in this novel, understanding the way that Golding presents Simon in this way is one of the most important, and I'll be returning to it many times in this sequence of videos. Only once the little uns are satisfied here does Simon turn away from them down a path which is so rarely visited by the other boys that it's only just perceptible. Simon is walking deep in the jungle where the air is dark and the creepers dropped their ropes like the rigging of foundered ships. Eventually, he arrives at a location which we will come to know simply as Simon's Place, and this is simply understood as the most beautiful area on the whole island. The whole space was walled with dark, aromatic bushes and was a bowl of heat and light. This place is quiet, secluded, peaceful, and utterly unspoilt by the presence of the stranded boys. And this seclusion is part of the appeal for Simon. He goes here to be alone and to appreciate the beauty of the island. And before moving forwards, he glances over his shoulder to confirm that he is utterly alone. And then he wriggles between some tightly woven creepers and finds himself secure in the middle of a little cabin screened off from the open space. And here Simon will sit and allow his senses to take in the beautiful sights and sounds of the island. The butterflies dancing around one another in the hot air, the bright, fantastic birds, the sounds of bees, the crying of the gulls returning to their roosts as evening approaches, and the crashing of the Pacific Ocean breaking onto the coral reef. As the evening progresses, bars of honey-coloured sunlight slide over the bushes and flowers and up into the tree canopy. Through the focalising influence of Simon, the green buds of flowers are compared, through a simile, to candles. And this is the second time that this comparison has been used, with the first being at the end of chapter 1, as the three boys, Ralph, Jack and Simon, head back down the mountain, having confirmed that they are indeed on an island. Here, as before, the association between Simon and religious figure is continued. He links the flowers to objects familiar to him from church. And indeed, Simon's behaviour in this location is very similar to the silent, peaceful and reverential behaviour of a parishioner in church. The other religious, biblical location that Simon's Place reminds us of course, is the unspoilt beauty of the Garden of Eden, and we'll need to return to this idea as our reading of the book continues. But before the chapter closes, Golding describes the approach of night time, with the heat cooling away and the flower buds drawing back their leaves, opening the tips of the flowers to the night air and allowing their scent to take back possession of the island. Possession from the boys, who, if you remember, claimed dominance over the island from on top of the mountain in chapter 1. This belongs to us, Ralph had said. Well, now, in this secluded spot of unspoilt beauty, with Simon sitting and watching and listening to the island in ways which none of the other boys appreciate, nature is triumphant and reclaims the island for itself. It's now night time, the light pricked down from the first stars, but Simon isn't troubled by this in the same way that we found the other boys are earlier in the chapter, screaming and crying out from their nightmares. He isn't even concerned about the prospect of walking alone back to the beach through the forest in the darkness, despite the earlier conversation with Jack and Ralph about the beast. Simon is at one with the island that holds no threat or fear for him. And this is a rare moment of peace and tranquility on the island, where the action fades into the background and the urgent clamour of the boys can almost be forgotten. But this won't last long, as in the next chapter the reasons for fear among the boys will become a lot more tangible, and a combination of events will occur which shake the foundations of the boys' fragile society and strain the relationship between Jack and Ralph to near breaking point.